There's an important conversation occurring in this country about whether we want to be a country of laws or whether we want to be a country without borders. It is one of the reasons the American people elected President Donald Trump, and that was to end the lawlessness at our southern border. It's within our grasp. We can do it. Importantly, some years ago, it was decided to arrest some people who crossed the border illegally, but anyone that brought a child with them would be given effective immunity from prosecution and would not be prosecuted. Word got out about this loophole, and the results were predictable. The number of aliens illegally crossing with children went from 14,000 to 75,000 in just 4 years, a 5-fold increase. This cannot continue. These children are not entering at ports of entry, but in dangerous places, in deserts, and crossing our fences and attempting to escape law enforcement officers. We do not want to separate children from their parents. We do not want adults to bring children into this country unlawfully either, placing those children at risk. But we do have a policy of prosecuting adults who flout our laws to come here illegally instead of waiting their turn or claiming asylum at any of our ports of entry. They can go to our ports of entry if they want to claim asylum, and they won't be arrested. We cannot and will not encourage people to bring their children or other children to the country unlawfully by giving them immunity in the process. Why wouldn't you bring children with you if you know you would be released and not prosecuted? After the policies of the last 8 years, we had hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors. These are people, children, young people that came without adults and their parents, coming through our borders, which has led to a resurgence of the violent MS-13 gang terrorizing high schools and even middle schools in Maryland and Long Island. I visited Islip, New York. I met with the parents of the 2 16-year-old girls that were murdered with machetes and baseball bats by MS-13. They told us there was a wing of the school known as the MS-13 wing. They told us even the administrators and teachers were afraid of these people. Most of the children we are caring for today in our system came here as unaccompanied minors. It's a much smaller number that are coming as a result with families, and that's happened and surged recently. In total, now when a child is brought here in that fashion or parents are prosecuted, the children are turned over within hours to the Department of Health and Human Services. They're not put in jail, of course. They're taken care of. They remain in the country, even though they don't have a lawful process to be here. That's an enormous cost that is being incurred by our government. Because we sent a message, a bad message, to those crossing illegally, if you bring children, you can avoid prosecution and deportation. This country is dedicated to caring for those children. You saw Kirsten just a few moments ago, and they are committed at Homeland Security, and within 72 hours, those children have to be at the Department of Health and Human Services. And the Secretary has made clear that they are working hard to always take care of them properly. So let's remember, we have a generous, lawful system that admits over 1 million people a year to permanent legal status in America. But when we ignore our laws at the border, we obviously encourage hundreds of thousands of people a year to likewise ignore our laws and illegally enter our country, creating an enormous burden on our law enforcement, on our schools, our hospitals, and our social programs. President Trump has said this lawlessness cannot continue. We do not want to separate parents from their children. You can be sure of that. If we build a wall, we pass some legislation, we close some loopholes, we won't face these terrible choices. The numbers will end. We will have a system where those who need to apply for asylum can do so, and those who want to come to this country will apply to enter lawfully. The American people are generous who want our laws enforced. That is what we intend to do, and we ask Congress to be partners in this effort. It is critically important that they help us at this critical time. So thank you again for having me here today. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you for this fabulous award. He looks like a pretty tough person, man, Jonathan. Good sheriff indeed. And that'll be something I will always cherish. My family will cherish, and I will never forget you for it. Our partnership is deep and strong. It's historic. We want it to get even better in the years to come. So it's always an honor for me to speak to you, those of you on the front lines of the nation's law enforcement, because you and I know what works. We've studied this. We've seen it in reality and in the academic world. We've reduced crime in America before. We intend to reduce it again. And in this joint effort, you can be sure about this. We have your back. You have our thanks. Thank you all, and God bless.
So we've just been listening to Attorney General Jeff Sessions speaking to a gathering of sheriffs in New Orleans. He received an award, gave a lengthy speech talking about law and order in this country, and just at the very end addressing the immigration crisis, repeating a couple of times in his speech, we do not want to separate children from their parents. We do not want adults to bring children into this country unlawfully, placing them at risk, and reinforcing what we've heard from other members of the administration, including the secretary, including the president, that there are legal loopholes that he feels need to be wrapped up, that a wall needs to be built and legislation passed. And at the end of the day, this administration's assertion is that they are just following the laws on the books when they arrest adults who are entering this country illegally. And when you are under arrest, you cannot bring your child with you into detention, that they are following the law, and because of that, they are separating adults from their children. So we have a few people standing by for us. David Begnaud and Maria Villareal, you're both there on the phone. You guys have been reporting from some of these border states and some of these detention centers. And Paula Reid, you are in Washington. Paula, you've been listening to what the Attorney General had to say. You know, his suggestion is what we've heard before from members of the administration, that there is a perfectly good system, an asylum system that many of these people can go through. At the same time, it was the Attorney General who made it very, very clear that if you are fleeing crime or domestic violence, that's not a reason to seek asylum in this country.
That's right. Sometimes I get asked, why does Jeff Sessions still have a job as Attorney General if the president is always tweeting about how much he dislikes him, how unhappy he is? Anne Marie, this is why Attorney General Jeff Sessions still has a job, because he is willing to enforce hardline immigration policies that the president promised on the campaign trail. And here you saw him take complete ownership of this policy, and even specifically when it comes to separating families, he said, look, we don't want to do that, but when we made exceptions for families, that encouraged more people to come here. He said, until we get a wall, until we get legislative solutions to prevent catch and release, we will continue to follow this policy. Now, he did, as you noted, he made a nod to the idea of asylum. If you truly believe you are being persecuted in your home country, you can come here to a legal port of entry and seek asylum. But as you noted, Jeff Sessions has also narrowed the categories that qualify for asylum. In fact, many people who are fleeing gang violence or domestic violence now have a much harder time of actually getting asylum. But that is currently a little bit of spin at the end of his speech. They're trying to say, look, we have a perfectly reasonable way to come here, claim asylum, but that's actually a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do. They're also arguing that if you come to a legal point of entry and validly claim asylum, you will not be separated from your children. But we know from reporting on the ground that that is not necessarily the case, and there have been instances where people have come to the border, claimed asylum, and still been separated from their children.
Stay right there for us, Paula. I want to bring in David Begnaud. David, you were able to get a tour of some of these detention facilities. You know, there's been a lot of talk about what these detention facilities are like, whether or not people are being treated fairly. You weren't able to actually bring cameras in yourself. Instead, the video that we're seeing is video that was given to us by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But tell me, David, what did you see inside one of these facilities?
It's a 55,000 square foot facility here in McAllen. Used to be a warehouse, and inside there are caged areas with netting on top, large areas. They're not packed in like sardines, so to speak, but caged areas. Like, this is not a place where you can just come and go. You can't leave. You are detained, right? You entered the country illegally, according to Border Patrol, and that's why you're here. The real pushback, Anne-Marie, that we're getting from Border Patrol is, would you please remind everyone that these people came here illegally? We didn't go get them and decide to hold them. We met them at an illegal crossing point where they should not have come through, and if they would have gone to a regular crossing and gone the right way, they wouldn't be here. Inside what we saw, the cages are, larger than others, but the bottom line is they're divvied up, right? So you have dads and kids if they came across the border together, and they're segregated in one cage. Then you have moms and kids segregated in another cage. And there's walking room. I mean, the kids were running around. They appeared to be happy. Most people were kind of just staring at us. I don't even know if they knew that we were journalists there to document what we were seeing. And then there was a fairly large cage of unaccompanied minors who actually came across the border by themselves. And Border Patrol was telling us there are so many cases where kids, 12, 13, 14 years old, come upon a Border Patrol agent and they are alone. Maybe they started the journey with mom and dad, but when they were detained, they were by themselves. And so here they sit in this detention facility alone. You can only be here at the facility where you're detained for 72 hours. They got to do something with you. You got to see a judge, and then, what happens is the parents see a judge, and at that point, when they go to see the judge, that's when they're separated from the child. Now, Anne-Marie, if mom and dad don't go to jail and the judge sends them back here, then they're reunited with the kid. But in many cases, the parents are sent away for days, weeks, months, and then you got to find a place for the child to go. So Border Patrol turns them over to another federal agency who may take them to another town or another city or another state and hold them until they can try and maybe reunite them with family members who live in the U.S. It's a complicated, lonely process.
It certainly sounds like that. Maria, you were in a different area. You were not able to get into a facility, but you were able to sort of view what's essentially sort of a series of tents that are being set up. Can you tell us about what's happening where you are?
So the area we're in is West Texas, so about 30 miles outside of El Paso, and this particular tent city was put together by the Department of Health and Human Services, kind of as an overflow shelter. What they have started to do is bring in unaccompanied minors from other shelters to make room for all of the other families and separating families and children that are coming across the border as we speak right now. So as far as we know, there are roughly 200 young boys in this facility. Between the ages of 16 and 17 years old. We understand right now that a lot of them are in good spirits. We actually saw them outside playing soccer. This morning while we were there at the facility, we could hear, from about a half a mile away, we heard dogs on the facility. We understand that they might have a pet there at the location shelter. So I think there is a true effort to try and make these children feel like children, like there is a sense of normalcy while they are in this facility. But as David mentioned, these facilities, there are 3 layers of security to keep them in this tent city. There is a barbed wire fence. There is a tent itself. When they're inside the tent, they're only allowed out at certain times of the day. And there is a wall around the perimeter. And then on top of that, there are security cameras everywhere. And on top of that, there are agents everywhere from the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, and also Health and Human Services. And so this tent city, we tried to get in multiple times. We have been denied access. While we were here yesterday, there was a huge rally, a march. Several hundred people were here. We saw Representative Congressman Joe Kennedy here, as well as Congressman Beto O'Rourke, try and get into the facility. Even they were denied access. So very few people are being allowed in to see exactly what's going on, which is what is drawing a lot of suspicion and concern, especially from the Democratic Party.
Of course, that's exactly it. You know, the media, observers, we need transparency. We're talking about minors who no longer have sort of the adults that have been protecting them on a grueling journey. The Homeland Security Secretary gave a speech in New Orleans not too long ago. She said, don't believe the press, that in fact these minors are being very well taken care of, that their educational needs are being provided for, their medical needs, the food that they need, and any other needs that they are able to verbalize. That's all being covered, but without being able to see it, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on. Paula, the president has been tweeting all morning long. I see a brand new tweet. Let me make sure it doesn't. Okay, he's on to tweeting about the Russia investigation. But prior to that, there was sort of a slew of tweets about what's happening at the border. What's the president saying?
The president's stance has been that this is all the fault of Democrats and that they are merely enforcing the law. But of course, we challenged the White House and the president about that last week repeatedly. We said, look, there's no law that requires you to separate families at the border. Certainly coming here illegally is a crime. You can prosecute people for that. But the way you're going about it, you are separating families, where in the past there have been exceptions for people that come here as a family unit. So most of the tweets today have been asking generally Congress on both sides of the aisle to, quote, change the law. Or there have also been tweets that are more specific, demanding that Democrats come up with a solution. But again, the Republicans control the White House, both chambers of Congress, and it was an Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, in this president's administration who 2 months ago changed the administration's policy to a zero tolerance. Everyone who comes across the border illegally will be prosecuted, can't bring kids to jail. Families must be separated, and they would not recognize any exception. You just heard Jeff Sessions address what he believes happens if they try to keep families together. He said, look, we've done that in the past, and it actually encouraged people to come here. So that seems to be the party line, both saying, look, it's not enough of a deterrent if we allow families to stay together, and the president really pretty much deflecting to Democrats, blaming them for the lack of a legislative solution.
Yeah, so far it's not working as a deterrent either, this new policy at all, because it seems a lot of people who are heading to this border aren't even aware of the fact that there's a policy change.
It is, but the administration has said on that point, you're absolutely right, the numbers so far do not show a deterrent. But the administration has argued that there hasn't been sufficient time for the message to get back to Central America to fairly judge the deterrent effect. Well, they've said a lot of things that I just don't think jive with reality or the law. That is one that I think is fair. So far, we don't actually have a true picture of whether or not this will work as a deterrent. Historically, though, this approach has not been a successful deterrent.
David, I want to ask you this question. Former CIA Director Michael Hayden has compared this policy of separating mothers and children to Nazi concentration camps. First Lady Laura Bush wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, very rare time where she's actually commenting on policy. And she compared this to the Japanese internment camps. Now, there's been pushback about these comparisons that, during those times in history, we're talking about people who were not crossing into another country illegally, who were detained, simply living their lives, and who were, the end result was a level of brutality, which at least here and across the world, there are periods in history that we're certainly ashamed of. So the comparisons may be extreme, but because you were in one of these facilities, I want to ask you, do you see where those sort of comparisons are coming from? Do you see areas of concern?
Anne-Marie, if you will forgive me, I'm always very mindful to not dip my toe in any of the emotion that sort of would inflame what is already an emotional situation. Yeah. So let me just stick to the facts and tell you what we observed. I didn't see anyone who looked like they were in pain, no one who looked like they were miserable. They seemed they had a blank stare on their face. They looked ahead, they sort of stared at us. In fact, at one point I thought, I don't want to point as I'm asking questions about them because I don't want to make them, uncomfortable. We kind of walked around with our hands behind our back and we just looked. There were kids who were eating chips and apples and running on mom's lap and snuggling with dad. It didn't seem like a chaotic situation. It seemed orderly and everybody seemed content. That is just an observation from a journalist who walked through the building. Now, we were not allowed to talk to them. So I don't mean to tell you that that's how everybody feels. I can only tell you what I observed with my, no one was screaming or waving or crying or looked aggrieved, but we weren't allowed to talk to them. We were told, here are the rules. No cameras, no audio recordings. You walk for 8 minutes. We got 15, and don't talk to anybody. We did ask one child, how you doing? And they kind of looked, they gave us a side look. And he said, I'm doing well. And he smiled, and that was about it.
Well, that's what we want from you, David, unbiased, sort of your observations, which is exactly what we need. Maria, I know where you were, there had been a number of protests. You spoke to lawmakers. You know, what are you hearing about what lawmakers are saying about what needs to be done? Why, you know, a number of lawmakers chose to spend their Father's Day at the border, at some of these border towns where this is occurring. Why do you think they did that?
You know, look, I think that this is an issue that has started to touch people all over the country, not just here along the border. And so when you're talking about Congressman, Joe Kennedy, I mean, he flew in and he spent several days here, obviously, trying to tour the facility. He was turned away. You have Beto O'Rourke, who is from this area. You also have Republican Congressman Will Hurd, who, you know, is on the opposite side of the aisle, who is coming out and saying, listen, I've taken a look at this facility. I've gone into the encampment. I know what it's like. And I am still appalled, even though I am not on, you know, I'm not a Democrat here. You know, so I definitely think what you're seeing is, you know, frustration, anger, surprise, you know, all these mixed emotions coming from these politicians, many of them representing, obviously, their constituents who are sharing these emotions with them as well. I think the biggest one right here is kind of a frustration and resolve. You know, clearly people want and realize that there is a problem. I think the issue is now going to be, how do you fix it? You know, we've spoken with not just the people who are at ground zero, right? The immigrants, the families, you know, maybe even the law enforcement. But there is a second layer. I mean, you're now going to have to deal with not just the people who are dealing with the first part of this process, but the second. I mean, you're talking about federal public defenders and immigration judges. They're the ones that are raising their hands as well and saying, hey, listen, part of the problem isn't just with them coming across the border illegally and then detaining them. Part of the problem is also making sure they get through the system properly. Are they granted asylum? You know, are they not? How long does it take to get their cases in? They are raising their hands now and saying, listen, part of this is the judicial process. We need to make sure to support the federal public defenders and the judges as much as possible. There's a 700,000 case backlog in the immigration courts right now. And immigration judges are telling me right now that is not because they are not working around the clock. It's because they just don't have the resources to handle the cases that are coming in the size and amount that they are seeing right now.
Yeah, you know, that's something that Kirsten Nielsen brought up during her speech to sheriffs. She reiterated something that she had said before, which is that there is a legal way to seek asylum in this country. You can go to a immigration building, you can say, I need asylum protection. But then she went on to say, part of the problem with the asylum system is a lot of people get in and there is a backlog of years to work through who really is a legitimate case or not. In fact, she said 80% of the people who seek asylum get thrown out, which means they're living in this country for years and years, establishing a life, and then ultimately having to leave. I think that there are a lot of different opinions about what's going wrong here or what's going on here. I think most people will agree that the immigration system is broken and a lot needs to be fixed. I know David Begnaud had to go. Maria Villareal, I want to thank you. And Paula Reid, if you're still there in Washington, I want to thank you as well for talking with me.